Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the ISFMP Policy Board meeting. My name's Jim Gilmore. I'll be chairing the meeting today. A few of us are a little tired from our festivities last night, and then we were wandering the city for hours because Tony abandoned us after she took us to a ball game, and people like me who aren't familiar with cities were completely stressed out trying to find my way back home. No, we had a great time last night at the ball game, and even though the Nats lost, the folks from the South were thrilled that the Braves won. So, so congratulations. Anyway, let's get into the agenda. First off, we have to approve the agenda, but I think we have a few changes we're going to make. First off, we're going to, there was an item 8 on the update on risk and uncertainty. We're going to postpone that to the annual meeting because that was J Mac. If you haven't heard, J Mac had knee surgery yesterday or the day before, so there's a ankle surgery, sorry. Some kind of leg surgery. Anyway, he's out of commission, so we're going to postpone that to the annual meeting. We are going to add in, there's a topic on, we were talking about strategic planning at the last meeting, and leadership went and had a meeting on this, so we're going to do an update on that. And I believe those are probably changes. Any other changes to the agenda? Okay, seeing those, we'll adopt those with the changes I just made. We had proceedings from May of 2018. They're in the briefing information. Are there any changes to the proceedings? Okay, seeing none, we'll adopt those by unanimous consent. Before each meeting, we have a chance for public comment on issues not on the agenda. Are there any public comments? I believe we have one from Ann Hawkins, who's going to talk about Rhoda. Ann, you in the, oh, great. Come on up to the public mic, Ann.
Thank you. I'm Annie Hawkins. I work with the Responsible Offshore Development Alliance and wanted to take a brief opportunity to introduce this new group that we formed to the Commission and talk a little bit about what we're doing and how we may be able to work together. And I apologize for having the sniffles this morning, but at least I decided not to make everyone fall asleep with a PowerPoint, so we'll keep it short. And so we're a new group that's come together of commercial fishermen up and down the Atlantic coast. We've got board members from Maine all the way down to North Carolina, some of whom are commission members, some of whom are council members. Eric Reed is the treasurer of Rhoda, so he's also a good resource to ask any follow-up questions, or he can correct me or supplement anything if he's got anything else to add. So the point of Rhoda is to sort of take a new approach to improve the compatibility of the new developments that we're seeing offshore on the outer continental shelf with commercial fisheries. Right now we're particularly focused on offshore wind as it's a huge issue, but we're also sort of structured in a way to address other things that may come, that will come down the pike, like sand and gravel extraction, offshore aquaculture, things that we're starting to see in the Atlantic. We found that over the last few years, the permitting processes and the use of scientific data going into these processes really has not been what we would like to see from the commercial fishing side. And we want to make sure that we are coming together with a unified voice in a way that makes us a lot more able to participate effectively in the process. So, like I said, we have 13 board members at this point from Maine down to North Carolina. Board members are individuals with direct interest in the commercial fishing industry. We have representatives from essentially every federally permitted fishery and some state permitted fisheries in the Atlantic. We are a membership-based organization. Our goal would be to have membership from absolutely anybody, you know, from the commercial fishing side who's interested in joining us and working with us on these topics. So Rhoda has sort of two main points. One is policy and the other is science. On the policy side, we like I said, that, so the main goal was to bring this unified voice so that we can be more effectively engaged in these permitting processes. We think there's a lot of value in having conversations directly with the fishing industry and with offshore energy developers and other developers and leaseholders on the Outer Continental Shelf. Those conversations have not been happening too much to date. And to coordinate among the many efforts that are going on with sort of each state and each developer that have their own advisory panels and are convening their own working groups of fishermen. It's been a lot of work for a lot of fisheries and a lot of fishing representatives to attend all of these meetings and to really keep on top of everything that's going on with every state and then federally. So we're hoping to sort of not we're hoping to, but we have been a way to coordinate a lot of those interactions and to be a clearinghouse. Get information out to the industry, get information back from developers, and just make everything a little bit more streamlined so that we're not spending so much time and effort chasing each individual project and each individual proposal. On the science side, we're in discussions with National Marine Fisheries Service, both at GARFO, the Science Center, and headquarters, to form a formal partnership on a new collaborative research program where we can really start to identify, prioritize the data gaps that we have and the sort of analytical efforts that we need to start to better understand how offshore leases should be sited and designed and make sure that they're as compatible as possible with fishing interests. So I think that's sort of the brief overview. I didn't want to take too much time, but just to let the Commission know that we're starting on this effort. We're starting to form our partnerships, sort of across the board, and hoping to interact with you guys down the road as we develop and really get rolling here. Thanks.
Thanks, Ann. Yeah, okay, we'll take a couple of questions.
And I noticed in your presentation when you started talking about also sand and gravel. Now, I'm very tied in the recreational community, and we've been looking at what's been going on in New Jersey for what they're doing, 30 miles of beach replenishment, and for the last 2 years. And basically, we have no inshore fishery in the last couple of years. And the same thing with the commercial. We lost numerous lumps, numerous places that were fish spots, and somehow they got on the plan and basically have been destroyed over the period of time. So I think if you're looking for a partner in some of this stuff when it comes to sand mining and things like that, also I've been at a number of BOEM meetings and basically sat with Greg and yelled at them when they basically don't put the proper overlays and show where the fish areas are. So if we can help, we basically will work with you.
Great, thanks. That's good to hear. And so I've had a lot of conversations with BOEM that program is going to be expanding quickly from New Jersey, from Maine all the way down to Florida. And so we're definitely keeping an eye on that. Thanks.
I'll let Eric have. Actually, Dennis had something else, whatever. I don't want to get into a big discussion on this because I don't want to break with the rules of public comment and we start getting into dialogue on it, but I'll take two questions. I got, who is it, Eric and Dave? Is that, you're looking for, go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just wanted to, because in Maryland we're going through a lot of these different issues, I just want to make sure that I get your contact information so that we can put our commercial fishermen in touch with these folks so they know that there's a concerted effort, so because they're struggling right now.
Thanks, Dave. Eric?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't have a question. I just want to say thank you, Mr. Chairman. Being from New York, you have some idea what's going on with wind power. A lot of four-letter words, wind, power. Wind is a four-letter word. There's a lot of other four-letter words that are associated with wind power. And Executive Director Beal has had some conversations with myself, and I really appreciate you guys giving us some time this morning. And we're more than happy to talk to you offline. Obviously, there's some interest in covering our collective rear ends for this matter. So thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Eric, and thank you again. Yeah, in my state and many of the New England states and expanding south now, this is becoming a major issue that I think the coordination and communication is going to be key in getting us out of this because we've had some very spirited meetings in New York on the topic. So thanks again. Other public, Dennis, do you have a comment on this or another public comment? Go ahead.
I just wanted to comment about our meeting conduct. I don't have a problem, but in the past couple of meetings, I've noticed a couple things, and I'll use some specific examples. Yesterday, Marty Gary chose to abstain in a vote. I don't think that the chair is under any obligation to abstain. I think the chair should be voting because they're here representing, in his case, the Potomac River, or Bob Ballou in the past representing Rhode Island. I think it's incumbent, and I thought it was obligatory for the chairs to vote. I mean, the argument could be made that chairs only vote to make a tie, break a tie. If that was the case, then I think that if you called a roll call, you'd call the chair last to do that. But I think the chairs, you know, should be voting. I think they I don't know how to say it. They probably think they're doing the proper thing by not voting, but I think that they come here to vote, and especially in a three-person caucus, it could make the difference of if there's a divided delegation. So I just think we should make it clear that the chairs, should vote. The other thing is several times the chairs have recused themselves from chairing the meeting. Pat did that, and I don't know who else did it. But I thought, I thought you only had to do that if you were representing yourself and not representing the department or the state. So I don't see a problem with sitting in the chair, but, if you're going to make a speech about something singular to yourself, then you should recuse. So again, I think that the chairs should essentially conduct the whole meeting other than exceptional circumstances. I just wanted to bring that up.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Dennis. I think, that the chair voting issue, I think, is, I think it's important you raise it that they have the opportunity to vote. But again, there is that rule about, most of my local councils are, the tiebreaker, issue. But I think it is important to note that if the chair so decides to either vote or not vote, that's still their, prerogative. And again, but they do have the capability to vote if it's an important enough issue. So I think that's good. The recusing thing is, that's a judgment call, and I understand that. But I think, if you're probably right, in some cases we probably could stay at the table. But we've become more sensitive in a lot of states about the perception of what we're doing, and are we being purely objective in running a meeting? So that's usually what I guide. So, but good comments. Thank you. Any other public comment before we move on? Okay, seeing none. Our first agenda item is an update from the state directors meeting. So I'm going to go into my notes the best I can. First off, there was one item. There was also Jay Mack was not at the executive committee meeting, and he was going to do an update on the appeals process, but we did not do that, so we've delayed that until rescheduled that for the annual meeting. One thing we did do, John Clark had sent a letter in on another point that we should consider under that, so we decided we are going to include that under Jay's effort. So I think that letter was distributed to everyone, I believe. So if you see that letter, you can get into the details of John's. But we are going to include that in the evaluation of the appeals process. The next item we got into was the update on federal appropriations. The short story is that we find ourselves in the great position of having a surplus as we're going into our upcoming time. So Bob's going to just do a quick summary of what he went through, just so you understand it, and then we'll come back to some suggestions on what we're going to do. Bob?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just very briefly, the bottom line is that due to congressional increases to the council and commission line, as well as some procedural changes at National Marine Fisheries Service, about $2.9 million of additional funding came to the 3 interstate commissions. Obviously, not all of it came to ASMFC, but a fair chunk of it did, and some of it was indirectly coming to projects like CMAP and some others. So the procedural changes, I think the best example is CMAP. Prior to the changes, there was overhead or administrative fees taken off at headquarters and then also at the regional office. The National Marine Fisheries Service made the decision that only maintenance and administration fees would be taken off at headquarters and no regional deductions would be made. So in the CMAP example, this freed up about $350,000 that could be applied to the CMAP program in the Southeast Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. So about a third of that went to the East Coast, and it's just it required no additional appropriations from Congress, but the National Marine Fisheries Service decided to treat some of the overhead issues differently, and it ultimately resulted in more dollars available for on-the-water research, which was great because the CMAP program was really kind of scraping bottom for now. And so, and there's other examples like that, and those procedural examples are about $1.4 million cumulative when you look at all three commissions. So it's a fair amount of money. The congressional increase to the council and commission budget line was on the order of like about $1.6 million, and the congressional language associated with that said that all of the increase was going to be distributed to the three interstate commissions, so ASMFC, Gulf States Commission, Pacific States Commission, and one international commission, which was a Pacific Salmon Commission. And after a number of machinations and back and forth with the commissions and everything else, about in the ballpark of $500,000 of that money has come to ASMSC, or will be coming to ASMSC in a 5-year cooperative agreement. And the final budget was approved by Congress pretty late in the process, as you folks know. So the only option that we really had was bringing that money to essentially our office and parking that in that 5-year cooperative agreement. We didn't have time to work with NOAA to distribute that money to the states through the formula, the Atlantic Coastal Act formula. So the bottom line is we have on the order of $500,000 at ASMFC. About $70,000 of that has already been set aside for an ACCSP data security audit. Since ACCSP houses obviously a lot of federal data, there are federal standards that must be upheld as far as establishing firewalls and passwords and all the other things that ensure folks aren't able to go through a website or some other portal and gain access to that federal data. So, as I said, 60 or 70,000 of that's going to be to conduct the audit. There may be some expenses on the back end to update hardware and software, but we'll know that once we get there. So, after the commission's overhead and other things, there's on the order of $400,000 available for the states to do things through the commission. And so at the state directors meeting in the executive committee, it was agreed that staff would go back and put together a proposal and some options for how what are the priority projects that can be used to, or this money should be used for. The one thing that we need to be able to do is go back to Congress and say, hey, we did some good stuff with this increased money. It can't just sort of be absorbed into the cracks and fund some meetings and other kind of non-spectacular things. So we need to make sure we have impressive and interesting projects and things that we can go back to Congress and say, we appreciate the money, and in fact we did some good stuff with the money you gave us. So we'll be working on that between now and the annual meeting. If you have any ideas that you think you want to get put onto this list, and the executive committee will be the ultimate folks who decide on the priorities. But I think one of the important things to remember is it is 5-year money. We don't have to spend it all right away. Keeping some available in case there's some dips in funding in future years, I think maybe part of the strategy as well. So that's that, Mr. Chairman. That's a summary of where we are, and we'll be reporting back at the annual meeting to the executive committee.
Thanks, Bob. And I think since the executive committee meeting, I've already been approached with several ideas. So at this point, I think the best thing to do, if you've got ideas, to send them directly to Bob, and then just CC me and Pat, and we'll make sure that they're included within staff's effort right now, and then we'll obviously have more discussion. So I guess that's what happens when you say you have a lot of money in a meeting. Nobody has any ideas, but they go to bed, and then suddenly there's 1,000 ideas. So anyway, which is good. Questions for Bob on this? Okay, seeing none. Our next item was on aquaculture. Louis Daniel, who's been heading up the Commission's aquaculture efforts, essentially did an overview on the expanding world of aquaculture. I think traditionally most of us in our states have had smaller scale things and have heavily focused on shellfish. However, the last couple of years, it's expanded dramatically, and now with the federal priority of aquaculture, it's expanding quite dramatically into things not only our traditional shellfish, but also inshore finfish, offshore shellfish, kelp. I didn't know what sugar kelp was until a few months ago, and now everybody wants to grow sugar kelp. It's the same thing with conflicting uses on it. So it's a very big issue, emerging issue at this point. And I think there was consensus in the room that it's an emerging issue for the Commission, important to the Commission, since it can have impacts not only maybe directly, but also in the species we manage, because we have a lot of areas that if you go offshore, we've got offshore wind, we've got offshore aquaculture, we've got shipping, we've got a whole lot of things going on out in the ocean. And I told the program, at the meeting the other day, I was at a resiliency meeting for the federal government a few weeks ago in Cape May, and I had a slide, and it's a fishing boat, and if you start bringing all these in, it looks like he's in the middle of the ocean, and by the time you put in cruise ships and protected species or whatever, suddenly the ocean gets to be a very crowded place for commercial fishermen trying to make a living. So anyway, with all of these issues, and particularly our focus on aquaculture, there was consensus that we should move ahead. We're going to form a committee made up of state, federal experts from different camps, whatever, to start looking and better defining this issue, its relationship to the Commission. And I volunteered my 2 new staff I have because our governor has committed $10 million to just shellfish aquaculture in the last year, so we were fortunate to get staff. So I've got some people that we want to put on this to better define how we move forward on this. So we will have this committee. We're not sure if it's a new committee or a resurrection of a previous committee, but we will have a group looking at this and then reporting back to us, hopefully initially at the annual meeting on suggestions on how we move forward. So that's that. Any questions on that? Craig.
More of a comment, I guess. In Connecticut, aquaculture is predominantly done, at least shellfish, through the Department of Agriculture. So I don't know how you imagine communication occurring if it's just with our agency of DEEP. Wouldn't necessarily give the Commission the whole story. So have you thought about that?
I'm not sure how many states are like that, and I know we were having the same problem with whelk, and now agriculture gave deep whelk in Connecticut. So now we can start talking about whelk. So that's a good point, Greg. I'm not sure. We'll probably maybe have to broaden that once we get an idea of how many states actually have in their agricultural department. But one thing that just in terms of Connecticut that makes this complicated, and Louis had brought this up, is that some of these things in terms of harvest or whatever involve federal permits from the Army Corps. And we have an issue in Oyster Bay that is different standards for Oyster Bay versus when we look at Connecticut, and we can see your dredges working that don't have the same restrictions that we have in New York. So there's a lot of inconsistency across the board we're going to have to look into. So it's a good point. Eric.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate the fact that the Commission is going to take up this issue. Being in the commercial fishing industry, we're suffering not quite the death by 1,000 cuts, but we're getting close. So it is a concern to us because the ocean is a lot smaller than you would think it is. So I appreciate the Commission either reactivating or activating, whatever it is, but it's good to see that effort. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Other questions, comments? Seeing none, we'll move on to our next topic was ecosystem reports. And Tony's going to give us a little update on that. That's essentially the council's put together. These ecosystem reports are pretty useful, and we want to maybe partner with them on that. So, Tony?
And I actually spoke with John Hare the other day after following up from our meeting, and we're going to work together to either develop an ecosystem report for just the commission or blend our ecosystem or blend some commission species into the current reports that the Northeast Fisheries Science Center is already doing for the Mid-Atlantic as well as the Gulf of Maine and New England areas. The South Atlantic Fisheries Science Center is, I think, in the process of starting to put together reports for the South Atlantic Council, and so we'll work with them to see if we can also get some species, commission species, into those reports, and John said that he would help us with that as well. So we appreciate that a lot.
Thanks, Tony. Any comments or questions for Tony? Wow, we're going to be out of here at 8:30. Thanks. Thanks, Tony. Next topic was MRIP. Mike Cahall came in. There's a white paper that was put together. As most of you are probably aware, that we took over, we had APIS, and it's been working very well. Mike presented a series of graphs and charts, and actually we've exceeded improvements, and I think they were looking for a 10-15% improvement. A lot of them is over 20%. Which was indicative that this, the state's running the program. The data is getting much better. I think those interactions with, the fishing community and people that understand the fishery works a lot better than having contractors. So there's essentially the NOAA Fisheries is interested in us taking over other parts of that survey. And Mike has been looking into that aspect and reported back that he's going to be pursuing that more diligently now, since it seems to make sense. And there's 3 other aspects of the program that he's looking into, and we'll be continuing to work on it. I believe, and if I recall, was it, I guess we would be shooting for sometime in 2020 where we would maybe take on these new efforts, but there will be updates on the details of that. And what it means, obviously, the feds have said that they would pay for the additional cost that would be transferred to the states. So there's a whole lot of administrative and funding issues that we would have to look at. But the general message is that if it's working under APIS, that we should maybe take on some other aspects of this to improve the data and just get MRIP to be a better predictive tool for our recreational fisheries. So that was sort of an update, and to be continued, and we'll be getting updates in the next couple of meetings. Any questions on that? Okay, seeing none. Our next item was, let's see. Oh, we're going to go into performance. Do you want to do the paper whales? Oh, the last thing we had was actually went into a closed door session. We had under the whale lawsuit, and Bob had given us an update on that, which is still in procedural things. So other than that, that was pretty much the end of the executive committee meeting. Any questions on anything I brought up during the executive committee meeting? Okay. Seeing none, we're going to go into the one item I added in, which was strategic planning. We currently are at the point where we are supposed to be doing a new strategic plan, and we talked about this a few months ago, but because of a lot of the things going on at the commission right now, a lot of times the strategic plans, we go through a workshop exercise and produce a document and then put a lot of effort into it, and then nobody kind of looks at it anymore, and there's so many issues going on. We decided that we would have, a discussion among the leadership and talk about maybe what's the best effort to be doing right now in terms of, the next few years. So we had a meeting up in Burn Island, Maine, and Bob will give us the details of, because he took notes, thank God. The rest of us were eating lobsters and drinking. We had a very good, actually, you know what, in some respects, when we got there and our planes were all screwed up and whatever, we got there late at night, I think we stayed up till probably 11 o'clock that night without any agenda, and I think it was probably one of the best meetings I've had at the commission, because you got to think with and brainstorm without really a lot of noise around you. So, and we kind of fed off each other, which I thought was very helpful. So anyway, Bob, why don't you give us the... And the fog, what's going on there? Yeah, and Pat graciously offered Burn Island for us to meet in a nice, perfect location that was away from all the noise except for the foghorn. So, Bob?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, and I was going to say the same thing. If Pat Kelleher invites you to an island off of Maine in the summer, you should probably take him up on it. If he offers to bring lobster, you should really take him up on it. So, it was a good spot. So the group that got together was me and Jim Gilmore and Pat as the current chair, and then we had previous chairs, Doug Grout, Robert Boyles, and David Borden. So the 6 of us got together for about a day and a half and just sort of tried to figure out, where the commission could and should go in the future. At the previous strategic planning conversation that the commission had, there seemed to be 2 levels of conversation going on. One is the very mechanical. We've got a strategic plan that expires at the end of this calendar year, and we need to figure out what to do about that. And then the next level was kind of the more philosophical, higher level thinking of how do we make the commission function better? How do we get the states to cooperate as efficiently and effectively as they can? Are we comfortable with where the commission is going and how it's operating right now? And that really, we took a lot more time talking about the latter, the kind of higher level. How do we get the commission functioning like a well-oiled machine that it can be, and it is obviously a very effective organization. So how do we capitalize on 15 states coming together? And really, the first thing that we agreed to was that the premise or the principle for all of our conversation is that the states are better off working together than individually. So, going into it with the mindset that bringing this group together is better than trying to have 15 states individually manage 27 species of fish, and so all the conversations stem from that. And there were a lot of different levels, but one of the things that we talked about was driving forces, and what are we reacting to right now? And climate change came up, or changing ocean conditions, I guess is what we're supposed to call it. Changing ocean conditions came up quite a bit, and that seems to be one of the underpinnings of everything that's happening around here. Fish are being distributed differently, productivity's changing, animals are in different places, and that obviously sparks the need and the interest for reallocation. Reallocation is a tough issue. Reallocation strains the cooperation between states. Strained cooperation between states means sometimes we knock on the door of the Secretary of Commerce and ask for his help, and all those things are just interrelated. The climate change, allocation, cooperation, secretarial interactions, and those seem to be sort of the one of the collectively, when you put those 4 issues together, it seems to be collectively the main issues that we need to tackle as a group of 15 states. So that was, again, that seems to be the driving force, and it seems to be, what we need to address in order to get, have this group continue to function as a strong organization. And one of the things that came up quite a bit was prioritization. The commission does we have obviously the 5-year strategic plan. We do a very detailed 1-year action plan, but in the middle, we don't do much. There's this 2 to 3 year planning horizon where there's not much going on, and we don't have kind of a rolling 1 year or 2 year prioritization and work schedule. And the group agreed that we need this sort of midterm 2 to 3 year planning is what we need to focus on. We don't putting together a 25-page action plan each year with all the details of that, sort of play-by-play things that the commission is going to do probably isn't the most effective tool. A lot of things in that large action plan are things that we have to do every year. They're mechanical. They're, Deke and I are going to go to Capitol Hill and do outreach on Capitol Hill. Laura is going to manage grants. Mike Cahill is going to manage data. But the things we need to focus on are what are the new projects and what are the priorities moving forward. And part of that discussion was there are some species that we deal with that maybe we can let them ride for a little bit. We need to refocus the energy of the commission on the high priority issues, the high profile things, the difficult questions, and sometimes we try to tackle every problem simultaneously across 27 species of fish, and I don't think we can do that. I think it strains sort of every level of the commission. It strains the staff to write the documents, it strains the scientists to support the documents, and it strains, frankly, the folks around this table. You guys only have so much time and so much bandwidth that you can put into the commission. So if you're trying to tackle high priority, medium priority, and low priority all at the same time, it gets pretty difficult. So those are some of the big issues we talked about, is reprioritizing those. The other thing that is related to that was improving our working relationship with the 3 councils and NOAA fisheries. There's obviously, as fish are moving differently, and this goes back to climate change somewhat, as fish are moving differently, the portfolio of activities at ASMSC and the 3 East Coast councils and NOAA fisheries seems to need to change a little bit, and there's times when we're cooperating and tripping over each other, and we don't have time to do our jobs, let alone duplicate effort at one of the councils. So we need to focus on that and bring. Then the idea is bringing the leadership of the commission, some leadership from the regions and NOAA fisheries, as well as headquarters and the 3 councils all together, and start talking about this distribution of work between all of us. And we'll try to get that going, maybe through the NRCC, and bringing the southern states or the southern South Atlantic Council to an NRCC meeting and start talking about that division of labor. Predictability, stability, it came up quite a bit as something that we want to work on. The orientation of new commissioners came up a lot. Can we do a better job of that? A lot of times there's new folks that pop up at our meetings on a fairly regular basis, and it seems to be at an increasing rate. So how can we do that a little bit better? I think we've done a good job of sort of mechanically getting new commissioners up to speed on what hotel they need to go to and how they fill out a travel form, but we may not be doing as good a job as we can about how do we kind of get those folks immersed in the commission culture and develop friendships and working partnerships with other states and the leadership of the commission. So that orientation indoctrination issue came up quite a bit. After we had all these discussions, and I haven't finalized the notes, they're still in working form. But the outcome, I think, at the end of the day-and-a-half meeting was that there is room for improvement, and we'll pull together all these ideas in a functioning document. It's not functioning yet. It's just my random notes, but we'll ultimately, I think what we decided was a workshop of some sort at the annual meeting in New York to bring everyone together, to put highlight and give some more detail of the conversations that we had, and really highlight some of the action items that we came up with on Burnt Island, and get the rest of get the input from the rest of you, and make sure that where the 6 of us thought we might be able to go, it makes sense for the rest of the group, and we'll put aside a couple hours at the annual meeting to talk strategic planning, and we may not have a new strategic plan on January 1st, 2019, but we'll figure out a way to bridge that gap. We'll get an action plan that focuses on 1 year, but incorporates 2 to 3 year timeline, and we'll bring that to the annual meeting as well. And so, I think that's the next step, is to put these notes in a functional form, get them to you guys, and get everybody together and start talking about where the commission goes collectively as a group of 15 states with our federal partners. So that's my quick summary. Maybe not that quick, but that's my summary of what we did. The other folks that were here can chime in if they'd like to.
That was perfect, Bob. That was I think that caught it pretty well. And other than to emphasize that I've been here about a little over 10 years now, maybe 11, and in that time, I think prior to my coming in 2007 and 8, the commission was the turnover was pretty low, and then I think in the last few years in particular, we've got some folks that have been around a long time, but more often than not, we've gotten new folks that, and kind of like that core of maybe what made the commission function more efficiently in the past, I think we want to tap into. Plus, with the new folks and the new commissioners in the room, there's new ideas we want to tap into. So again, following that theme of on Burnt Island, I think if we can, get a workshop together and not have distractions for a couple of hours, I think we can come up with even some better ideas as we move forward. I'll leave it up to the other folks that were at the meeting. We did have to take Robert Boyle's cell phone away because he's been Googling all those great expressions of, hanging together or will hang alone. So that was very helpful. Robert was. We have to come up with it. Whatever it's great though. Anyway, so other comments, or if any of the other members that were at Burn Isle want to chime in and make some comments, please do. If not, if there's questions about or comments about how we're going to proceed. John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And those sound like great ideas. I feel the same way about the 5-year plan. Every time it comes up, it's like, oh, that's right, there's a 5-year plan. I'm just curious, when you say a 2 to 3 year plan coming off of 1 year, what is the difference here? Can you give a little more detail of what you're thinking on that, Bob?
Yeah, John, I think the group felt that a 2 to 3 year kind of rolling plan would be a lot more effective and a lot more informative to the commissioners, rather than this document that we only look at once every 5 years and then it gets dusty. So it would be a document that we haven't really mapped it out, but I envision something with a lot of detail in year 1. In year 2 and 3, it maps out some of the longer-term projects, such as stock assessments and amendments and longer-term addenda that we're going to work on. And I think hopefully it's a helpful tool that says, maybe we need to do something on species X, but that's going to have to wait till year 2 or year 3 to tackle that. It's not as high priority as, sorting out black sea bass, as Adam Nowalski was talking about yesterday. We've got a mess on our hands there, and we need to put a lot of horsepower into that to figure it out. So, maybe things that are lower priority and longer term issues, they get displaced a little bit while we work on the high priority issues. So, I think we still have to have, or it's still valuable to put down some of the driving forces and other things, but I think we really want to focus on mapping out our workload over the next 2 to 3 years.
So a time frame where you can stay specific.
Yeah.
Other questions? Babalu?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I just want to throw out the thought about the application of strategic planning at the board level, because I think, and black sea bass is a perfect case in point, I think we emerged from yesterday's board meeting with 3 working groups, one to continue, 2 new ones, and I mean, we're doing everything we can to try to get our arms around the vast array of issues, and there are quite a number associated with black sea bass, which as board chair makes me feel compelled to try to get those organized in some sort of strategic plan for just that species. And of course, that board deals with 3 species. So, and I'm not aware that that is really part of our process, that we do strategic planning at the board level. And while I totally recognize and appreciate the importance of doing it at the higher level, I think part of the discussion should be to think about how we could sort of institutionalize it at the board level, because I think it could really help. We spin so many issues up, and then we only have an hour and a half, to address them all, and inevitably we don't get to them all, and inevitably some fall off, and then people say, didn't we already decide to do that, and where is that? So I just want to throw that out as a suggestion. It may not be as applicable for every board, but certainly for the board that I'm currently working on, boy, do we need organization and guiding principles to kind of move us through the next 2 to 4 years, as it may be, to try to fix some of the major problems we're facing in those fisheries. So just want to throw that out as something that relates, but that didn't sound like it was in the mix of discussion, but I think it might be an element worth pursuing. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Great point. I think that's right on the money, and I think that'll help out in our discussion when we move this forward. And did a great job yesterday, by the way. I was sitting there, and it's exactly, that point is that, it kind of stepping back and looking at how we're managing stuff instead of just following what we've done in the past is really where we need to get to. Other questions? Okay, so we'll get that together for the annual meeting, and hopefully we'll have a more robust discussion at that point. Okay, next item is the review of annual performance of stocks, and Tony's going to lead us through that. Tony?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. All right. So as a reminder, this is a part of our 5-year strategic plan. So we do get reminded of our strategic plan every year when I go over the annual performance of the stocks, slightly. This was initiated back in 2009, and several of the tasks that we developed for our action, like our one-year action plan, come from this review of the annual performance of the stocks, or in theory would come from this review of the annual performance of the stock. We want to look at validate the status of each of our species, as well as look at the rate of progress that the boards are making in rebuilding these important fisheries. And if the board is not satisfied, the policy board is not satisfied with the speed at which some of these stocks are rebuilding, then is there any additional corrective action that this board could make in recommendations to the individual species boards? And that leads to input in the 2019 action planning process, which may be a little different, as we just heard, for next year, but it doesn't mean that this can't lead to advice into whatever process that we use, as well as I said before, feedback to the species management boards. So we have 5 categories for species: the rebuilt and sustainable, recovering and rebuilding, species of concern, depleted species, and species that are unknown. I'm going to get more into the species of concern, depleted, and unknown. The list for species that are rebuilt and sustainable or recovering and rebuilding have not changed from last year. These have all stayed status quo. Well, this is all based on, and this is all based on information that we had prior to the board meeting. Sorry. So as we did hear from the assessment from Atlantic Herring, I would suggest it probably would move to a species of concern. While it's not overfished and overfishing is not occurring as the base of the current assessment, if we added 1 more years of data, we would probably be have overfishing occurring and be overfished, Megan, or just overfished? You can't. Yeah, that's all right. Sorry, put you on the spot there. So for species of concern, we have coastal sharks, horseshoe crab, summer flounder, and winter flounder. For 2 of these species, horseshoe crab and summer flounder, will be having assessments in the upcoming year, so there's not much information that has really changed in terms of the science and the recommendations that the TC has made, so I'm not going to go into details on those. And coastal sharks has such a large number of species and species complexes. I'm not going to go into each of those individual species, but the Coastal Sharks Board yesterday did initiate a management action to help the board respond to some of the changes in a quicker fashion when it's looking at management changes that HMS has either promulgated through emergency action or already done through federal rulemaking, in order to close loopholes in state waters more quickly. So for winter flounder, the first addendum in 2009, Addendum 1, reduced both the recreational and commercial harvest by 11 and 31%. And then following in 2011, for the stock status NOAA fisheries, increased the 2012 state water subcomponent to 272 metric tons based on the overfishing status. And this was an expansion of the rebuilding timeframe, which allowed that change to occur. The Commission's Winter Flounder Board in 2012 increased the maximum possession limit for non-federally permitted commercial vessels from 250 to 500 pounds. And then in 2017, NOAA Fisheries reduced the state water subcomponent to 67 metric tons and reduced the total stock-wide annual catch limit from 428 metric tons. The Commission's board has maintained its trip limits in Gulf of Maine winter flounder since 2012. This is one of the stocks that the Commission has expressed concerns to the New England Council. While we have some fairly restrictive measures in this fishery, we haven't seen much change in the rebuilding of this species. And we're just concerned, and because we are just not really sure why that rebuilding is not occurring, and it's something that we've had some conversations with the council about and hope to move those forward. For depleted species, we have American eel, the southern New England, American lobster, American shad, Atlantic sturgeon, northern shrimp, river herring, tautog, weakfish, and winter flounder. The only change is that sturgeon moved from unknown into depleted with the results of the stock assessment last year. For southern New England lobster, there's not a lot of changes in terms of the status of the stock since the 2013 assessment. I won't go over those again. And the technical committee had advised to use output controls. The board continues to use input controls. The TC had recommended some extreme reductions in harvest, but the board approved a 10% reduction. The board did approve additional reporting. It's going to move to 100% reporting over a 5-year time frame, which is something that the TC had been recommending to the board for a while. For river herring, while the commission has in place sustainable fishery management plans for in-river harvest, the TC has also made recommendations to address bycatch and ocean fisheries. Both the New England Fishery Management Council and the Mid-Atlantic Council has addressed bycatch in federal waters through catch caps. Some of the states have not addressed bycatch in their state ocean waters. For northern shrimp, we have seen some all-time lows in total biomass since roughly 2012 in the northern shrimp fishery. There's been a moratorium in place since 2015. The board has continued, or the section has continued to do that over time following the advice of the technical committee. And this is another species where we're not seeing significant changes in rebuilding, even though we've made some drastic changes to the fishery and not having one at all. For tautog, the 2016 stock assessment indicated that the Long Island Sound and the New Jersey, New York Bight regions were experiencing overfishing, and then both the Long Island Sound, New Jersey, New York Bight, and the Delmarva regions are overfished. The assessment proposed new reference points for each region and management programs, in which the board adopted through Amendment 1. The one difference was that the board approved a lower harvest reduction for Long Island Sound, 20.3% versus 47% that was recommended by the technical committee. And while I have everyone's attention on tautog, I've gotten a lot of questions about the tagging program that is a part of Amendment 1. Caitlin and myself have been trying to work together with the tagging company to get the applicator for tags as well as the tags so that both products are easy to use on the water, and we're having some difficulty with that company. There's only one company so far, really, that we have found that the tags are non-tamperable and can hold all the information that we need. And so we are going to continue to do that, but I don't believe we are going to be able to implement that program for 2019 at this point, based on not having a prototype that seems feasible to Caitlin and I, as well as the time frame in which states would need to implement a mandatory tagging program at this point. So we're hoping that we can get a better prototype so that states can have their fishermen at least do some trials in 2019 and then have that program be a requirement for 2020. If we can't get the company to make an app, and it's really the applicator that's the problem right now. If we can't get the company to make an applicator, we're going to try to source an applicator from a metalsmith in some other way as soon as I track a metalsmith down. So if anybody knows any, let me know. All right, moving on. Winter flounder in the southern New England, mid-Atlantic area. The stock is at 18% of the SSB target. It has remained low and declining since the early 2000s. Recruitment has been declining since the early 80s. It was at an all-time low in 2013, and there was an ever so small slight increase in recruitment in recent years. Following the TC advice, the board maintained a 50-pound trip limit for non-federally permitted commercial vessels. And in 2018, NOAA set the state water subcomponent at 73 metric tons, which was a slight increase from the 70 metric tons in 2017. And the total stock-wide annual catch limit was reduced from 700 metric tons, to 700 metric tons from 749. This is another species that we are working with the New England Council on and hope to make some progress with them. For unknown species, there is the Atlantic croaker, Jonah crab, spot, and spotted sea trout. For Jonah crab, the landings have continued to increase in a rapid rate since the early 2000s. The landings were at 17.25 million pounds in 2017. The status of this resource is still unknown, and there's not enough information to conduct a coast-wide stock assessment at this point. We still need to get age information, so there are some states that are conducting age at maturity studies to help with this. We also need to get additional information on the extent and motivation of their migration patterns and have research on the recruitment of juvenile Jonah crabs, as well as get size distribution, sex composition for Jonah crabs in order to conduct the assessment. Included in that lobster mandatory data harvester reporting requirement, Jonah crab will be a part of that, so we will get some additional information from all states in that 5-year time frame when that addendum comes into play. So after this meeting, the board will hear some new information on Atlantic croaker and spot in terms of how to get better information on this species for status of the resource using the traffic light analysis. The TC is going to recommend that we use this new version of the traffic light, which looks at age and regional distributions. And so it'll be their recommendation to utilize those and do some management changes because some of the triggers under the new traffic light will get tripped for both of those species. So we'll see how the South Atlantic Board responds to the TC's advice for those two species. So again, from this, is there any direction or feedback that is necessary or needed to go to individual species management boards? And is there anything that this board would like to direct for planning in 2019?
Thanks, Tony. Questions, comments, directions? We put this on the agenda too early. No one's awake yet, so. Roy Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Tony, for the briefing. Do we have any special emphasis on depleted species? You know, we continue to list southern New England winter flounder, weakfish, southern New England lobster as depleted species. American eel is another one, still listed as a depleted species, year after year after year. And the public sees this, and the optics of it are frankly not favorable for us. What can we do to emphasize work on depleted species, and what are we doing? I'm curious. Thank you.
I mean, outside, I mean, it's what each of the management boards, how they respond to the TC's advice on these depleted species. At times, I understand that some of the advice is not necessarily fishing related. It may be something else for shad and river herring, eel. It may be looking at habitat recommendations in order to improve passage, those types of things. But it's up to the board to either put the emphasis on those species or not. And so in some cases, there is some emphasis. In other cases, I think that there is less emphasis, and the priority goes to other species. And so it's the direction from either this board to those individual species boards to do more work on those species, or up to the individual species boards as well. But this is the kind of feedback that we would be seeking here in order to drive that the action plan for next year, or, you know, specific directives back to those individual species boards. And my other question back would be to you all, Roy was the only person that had his hand up before, and every year we go through this action of going over the annual performance of the stocks, but there's usually not much direction. And so I'm trying to determine whether or not if this is a useful activity for the boards or not, for this board or not.
Go ahead, Roy, follow up.
Quick follow-up. I think the public would benefit from an explanation. I know we have our annual status of the stock reports, but I think the public can understand that there are certain things that are beyond our control, like climate change has already been discussed. But if we were to emphasize in our stock reports for these depleted species what we think the drivers are, and what's within our control and what's not within our control, I think it would be helpful for the general public to gauge how we're doing as a commission. Thank you.
Yeah, I like that idea, Roy, because and I know under Magnus and some of the suggestions to get rid of overfished to depleted, but then how much of that is under our control? And I think that's probably a good idea to start at least listing the things that maybe we'll have a chance of improving, you know, given the circumstances. So, Richie White.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's what I was going to add to what Roy was initially saying, that for the public, I think it's really important to show the species that there's nothing left for us to do. I mean, we can't affect a comeback, and have those listed separately from ones that we are working on and that we do have some ability to make some changes.
Doug?
Yeah, I had the same, a similar point, because I look at some of these species. The board has been, on some of these species, has been very active. Southern New England lobster, since we got this overfish, we've spent a lot of time trying to address that. We have put in a number of management actions. Whether it's going to be effective or not, that's the question, you know, because of the impact of climate change. There's been a lot, even though shad and river herring, we have put through major amendments, but there's a lot of work going on up and down the coast to try and improve the habitat and the availability of habitat. The council has put in actions to try and reduce the, or at least cap the amount of bycatch that's going on. So there is a lot of work that's going on. Some of them, you're right. Southern New England winter flounder, we've been kind of sitting there, but it's because it seems that the council is the driving factor on this, even though we do have our own management plan that addresses things in state waters. So I know some of the reviews here talk about some of the actions that we've been working on. They've had a brief description in there, but you know, maybe it does. This whole concept of species that we have definitive information that climate change is affecting their abundance levels, maybe we need to have something like that in there for the public to realize that some species like northern shrimp There's not much we can do other than to put a moratorium on there.
Thanks, Doug. Dan?
Yeah, I think one of the problems comes from the term depleted, that if I haven't done my laundry in a week, my sock drawer is depleted. And I think the implication of a stock that's depleted is that it's been overused or extracted to a very large extent. So we always struggle with that. But to Roy's point, I think it would be useful when ASMFC publishes some kind of a report that depicts a stock in not so healthy condition, that they could include links to things that the individual states and the Commission are doing. So, for example, in the case of eels, there's a lot going on with enhancing eel passage. You know, Maine's taking down dams, and in Massachusetts we're putting up eel ladders. And so I think Roy brings up a good point that, you know, try to get some highlights of the little things that are going on collectively by the states.
Thanks, Dan. Eric?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, there's something in state waters that we just don't ever, we want to talk about it, but we never talk about it because we can't. That's seals. You know, when you come to something like flounders, I mean, they're depleted because the seals are eating the damn things. So we need to have some conversation at some point what the effect of that population is on fish stocks in general. We just don't seem to be able to have it. So you talk about cod, you should talk about seals. You talk about anything that's in state waters, you should talk about seals. So I'd like to see that in the mix too. What's the effect of that population?
Yeah, seals and cormorants, and I told my counsel that the day I have to give out depuration permits on seals, I think I'm quitting because I don't want to be around for that feedbacks. Tom?
Yeah, we can blame seals for a lot of things, but a lot of what's affecting the stocks, like with the flounder, are not seals, but other environmental things that we've been doing. You know, one of the reasons we started the Habitat Committee in '93 was to look at this, and then we reel into the brick wall because we don't control what other agencies do. And, you know, and you look at what some of these stocks, you know, it always makes me sad when I look at weakfish. I mean, the last Atlantic Coast Conservation Act came about because now Senator Carper, but then Congressman Carper wanted to put a bill in on weakfish to bring it back. And I thought we did everything we should to bring it back. And look at the stocks now. They're in worse shape than when we started building the plan. There's no fault of our plan. It's things that we can't control. But there's a lot of man-made factors that are affecting what stocks are doing, and especially in the inshore stocks. If we look at winter flounder, we look at weakfish, we look at any of the estuarine-dependent species, and you look at the change of sewer plants from the 70s on, the Clean Water Act, when we changed how we handled sewer, and started putting chemicals into the environment that weren't there before, and because they bind other chemicals. So we need to basically point that out, but we don't have any control over it. There's nothing we can do as an agencies, and that's always where the problem ran. We make comments, even the National Marine Fisheries Service makes suggestions, but then it's BOEM or somebody else that makes the decisions, or the Army Corps of Engineers, as we found out over the years. So there's real concerns of how we do that.
Thanks, Tom. Other questions? I'll go to the audience in a second, Arnold. I just wanted to, when you said seals, Eric, we were at the state directors meeting in South Carolina, and we have this problem, and I thought how difficult it is with, you know, these things eating our species we're trying to manage. And then Oregon, if you haven't heard, has that unique thing where they have the endangered seal eating the endangered salmon. And it's almost funny that they said, well, did you ever think of moving the seals out? And they said, yeah, we put them in trucks, we drive them to the coast, and they're so attuned to this. They beat the truck back to the place where they're eating all the salmon again. So it's just, so I said, well, there you go. We don't have it that bad, at least, so we don't have endangered species eating other ones. But any comments on the board before I go to comments in the audience? Okay, Tony.
I'm still going to pose my question back to the board. Is this a useful exercise every year for you all? Is there any advice or recommendations that you want us to utilize in order to drive the action plan for next year, or advice back to the species boards? Because we have the status of the one-page status of the stock sheets that we already do, and then we do this in addition to those. And I'm just trying to figure out what's the best way to get information to this board and then get feedback to the species boards or to staff for doing the annual reviews. And there doesn't seem to be much advice back to for either of those things coming out of this discussion, and so I'm trying to figure out if this is a useful exercise every year or not.
Pat?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's a very useful exercise, and I think moving forward, if we do go in the direction of this kind of 2 to 3 year rolling plan, it becomes even more relevant. I think the comments made here today in regards to these species that cannot be helped in a separate section or column for those species is going to be critical, and I think the depleted comments by Dan are also are on point. I am surprised that Dan does his own laundry, though. But other than that, I see it as, and I also see it as more broadly than just this board. I think I get more comments about this list from the public than I do individual boards. So I think from a public perception, you know, the outward-facing transparency of the commission is important, and I think that that's really where this this list comes to play.
Steve?
Yeah, I concur. I think this is very useful. I think where, you know, from North Carolina's perspective, where I think we were getting hung up is in the terminology, and the terminology was confusing to the public, and so we did away with it. And so our stock overview for this year that I'm going to present to our state commission next week will just be specific to the fishery management terms. Is it overfished? Is overfishing occurring? And then if we do have concerns, what are those? If we have unknowns, what are those? I think often we get trapped in our own terminology trying to be helpful. And for example, with herring going from rebuilt sustainable, then it kind of skips recovering and goes right to concern. From a public perception standpoint, there, you know, everybody would be like, "Oh my God, what happened? You skipped one." You know, so I think it's very helpful. I think the narrative is extremely helpful for us as a state.
Emerson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I find this to be helpful and would suggest that we continue with it. It condenses all this information into one place for us and for the public, and it brings this information in front of us every year so that we can have a discussion like this, and as well as keeping this information in mind when we go back to the work of our individual boards.
Thank you. Doug? I had Adam first.
I would defer to a past chairman.
I will be glad to defer to the distinguished commissioner from New Jersey, and I'll take second seat here.
Well, I want to get home today, so I'll continue with my comments. I agree that this is useful. I think the comments we've heard around the table about perhaps there's some concerns about the information we're presenting to the public and how it's perceived may be relevant. I recall when we went through the process of providing the definitions for these 5 status that we offer, came to the conclusion that depleted was a better use for overfished, where we were using a term previously, and we came up with the definition of reflects low levels of abundance, though it is unclear whether fishing mortality is the primary cause. Well, I think we can all conclude that for a number of these species under depleted at this point, weak fish, winter flounder, southern New England, northern shrimp, fishing mortality is definitely not the primary cause at this point. So I don't know if whether we can just modify that definition we've had, whether it's time for a 6th definition here, whether we find some way to add that discussion to the individual species sheets where we're clearly identifying that. But if there's this concern about the public perception of depleted and the public believing that it may be due to us not doing our jobs due to fishing mortality, we would use this tool to find a way to clearly define that for those species we know fishing mortality is not the primary cause. Let's put that front and center.
Thanks, Adam. Doug.
The distinguished commissioner from New Jersey stole my thunder. But I agree with him totally. I know we struggled. We worked very hard to come up with some definitions to replace overfished and overfishing, to try and get the public perception that it was, in some cases, that we weren't doing our job, to depleted, and depleted clearly reflects, at least according to our definition that we worked very hard on, that it may not necessarily be something related to fishing mortality. And there are a number of species where that applies. Now, maybe as Adam suggested, and as well as Dan, maybe there needs to be some kind of a split out where if we know the cause is overfishing, then we need to put those species in one category, and then another, and then the ones that are impacted by changing ocean conditions into a depleted category.
Yep. Bob?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The other thought is that the species that are on the rebuilt sustainable, kind of the good news list, that almost implies there's nothing to do, or we're in good shape, we can let them ride. And talking or reflecting back on our conversation in Maine, there's a lot of work to be done on some of those species. Pat Kelleher and I are running around Capitol Hill trying to find money for Gulf of Maine, George's Bank lobster to do research to stay ahead of climate change issues and make sure they don't get into the northern shrimp category where there's nothing else we can do, or the southern New England lobster category. So, and black sea bass, as I mentioned earlier, there's, it's on the good news list because the stock's in good shape. It doesn't mean there's not a lot of work that the Commission and Council have to do to fix those species. So I think, highlighting the challenges, even though there's a lot of them, doesn't mean we can just sort of sit on our hands and let those kind of cruise for a while. There's a lot of work to be done on some of those. So I think we can, when this was, as Tony said, this has been going on since 2009. We've been providing this report. It was really focused on biology. Are there enough animals in the ocean of each species? And I think we've kind of, evolved since then, and there's some other pieces that we can probably include in this presentation to help the public understand that just because there's a lot of them doesn't mean there's nothing we need to do, but, and just because there's none of them doesn't mean there's a lot we can do. Just kind of describe where they are a little bit better. So that's just another thought.
Yeah, good points there, everyone. And since a few have mentioned that you only hear from the public, why don't we take a public comment? Arnold, Leo.
Yeah, thanks. I am Arnold Leo. I represent the fishing industry of the town of East Hampton, Long Island. And well, first I should say I have always found this summary very useful, Tony, and hope that it continues to be available. The first comment for Tony. I'm not sure if you've ever tried to manually, physically handle tautog, but they are an extremely powerful fish and very, very difficult to handle. When I was pound trap fishing, we always did everything we could to avoid having to actually put our hands on them. So we usually moved them around with a dip net, So I just think that any tagging program for them is going to run up against that difficulty of actually handling them to put a tag into them, So I just mentioned that for the record. But The concern I have is that, with the recalibrated landings data, it seems to me that it may affect some of these categorizations here. For example, striped bass, which actually is at 150% of its rebuild goal, has certain triggers that are sort of right on the edge. And with a recalibrated, biomass, that may indeed show that it's in much better shape than believed. Is that being taken into account? And
Arnold, for each of these species, we will do assessments with the updated MRIP information, the calibrated data, and when we do those assessments, it'll be reflected in this report. But until a stock assessment is done for each individual species, we won't use the new calibrated data. It'll be just a part of our assessment process each species will go through. For species that we don't have reference points that are based on the catch, if there are some, then we can start to utilize those species, or utilize the calibrated data for in the next year's report. But this report mostly just used the uncalibrated information since it was pulled together before that data were released.
Yeah, thanks. And just finally, as Adam and others have said, I think it would really be useful on the depleted stock to make that further distinction between those species such as weak fish, where no matter how much you curtail fishing efforts, you're not going to, it has yet to show any improvement in, the biomass. So it just seems that that would be very useful to show in this listing those species which are, beyond the reach of management efforts. Thanks.
Thanks, Arnold. Well, from the sounds of it, it looks like it's a good idea to continue this for all the reasons mentioned, and just also that we periodically then are forced to look at it, because if we don't, we're going to forget about them, and then suddenly said, whatever happened to weak fish or winter flounder, which occasionally have shown pulses of improvement, and we've gotten some actually good numbers this year on winter flounder on the South Shore, which nobody can figure out. So, so Tony, you did a great job on this, and that's what you get, as your reward as you get to continue this. So,
thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have great staff members that help pull this together.
Okay. Great.
Of all the species that are on one list or the other, is it possible to have staff make a recommendation as to which one is most likely to fall from a good list to a not so good list, and one that we could conceivably move the needle on if we did certain things? I think about this newfound resource of federal money and wonder whether science might help us get somewhere. Eels, for instance. There may be some states that have a population that don't know they have a population, don't have the resources to know whether they have a population. Yet the value of that resource is such that if we did have that information, we might be able to stimulate changes in behavior where passageways were developed, dams were removed, that sort of thing. So it's not, I don't have any idea what might trigger those decisions, but I just wonder, sometimes it's a matter of picking something that we can make a difference on rather than looking at the totality of some number of species and saying, if we put a little bit of focus here and a little bit of focus there, we can't demonstrate a significant change. So that was my thought. But I do think it's a worthwhile exercise that you're going through now.
I don't have an answer for you, Craig. I'd have to think about it a little. And maybe for some species we could, and other species we might not be able to figure that out at all.
Well, and that's my point. If there are some that we could, then maybe that's where we should focus, not to say that any is less valuable. It's just that there might be an impact. Thank you.
All right, we'll get Tony a crystal ball for her toolbox. And all right, we're going to move on. Our next topic is coordination between ASMFC and the New England Fisheries Management Council on Atlantic herring. Bob, Pat, and I met several weeks ago with the New England Council leadership to discuss sea herring management, and I think from that meeting we agreed that better communication and coordination on sea herring management, was necessary, considering the status of the stock, and that there was one suggestion was that that the herring section was a section with ASMFC, and maybe that was not conducive to the improved communication. So it was brought up at the Atlantic herring section on Tuesday, and Pat was the chair. So you want to just do a little background and show you? Oh, oh, okay.
Perfect. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As the chair said, there's been a couple conversations, actually, with a meeting between leadership and the council, and that spilled into the, as my staff called it, the jamboree we had on Burnt Island. I don't know where they got that idea, but we did have a very good conversation at the section, and there's nothing like a depleted stock to bring everybody together in the spirit of cooperation. So as such, a motion was made by Mr. Reed and seconded by myself, and I'll read it into the record. Move to recommend the policy board to change the herring section to a board and invite the New England Fisheries Management Council to have one voting seat. This action is conditional on the council adding an ASMFC seat to their herring PDT and an ASMFC seat to the herring committee, with the understanding it is not the same person. So as this was a section motion, it doesn't need a second, but we would open the floor for conversations. Tony?
I just want to add one little word in there, that it was an ASMFC staff seat to their herring PDT and an ASMFC seat to the herring committee. There's a small distinction.
Discussion on the motion? Seeing none, is there any objection to the motion? Seeing none, we will adopt that and approve that by unanimous consent. So the herring section is now the herring board. Thanks, everyone. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Item 7 is you have an update on the Atlantic Coastal Fish Habitat Partnership, and Lisa Havel is going to give us that update.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief as always. The steering committee for ACFIP met in person May 17th through 18th in Savannah, Georgia. We received updates on the science and data initiatives, our Southeast Mapping Project, our website update, and collaboration with the National Fish Habitat Partnership and other fish habitat partnerships. We'll give a little bit of information on our Southeast Fish Habitat Mapping Project. This is funded by NOAA, and it covers North Carolina down to Florida. We're spatially prioritizing fish habitat protection and restoration sites. We're using variables in the analysis such as habitat, threats, like impervious surface, as well as species diversity for some regions. This is a GIS mapping and analysis, and we're looking at diadromous, estuarine, as well as coastal for South Florida corals. The results of the analysis will be available online in a website-based tool. We will also have static maps available for each weighted variable that went into each analysis, and provide information on how to access the original data sets. This will be finalized in the next few weeks, and we have received funding from NOAA to move this project up to the Northeast as well, so we'll be covering the entire Atlantic coast. ACFIB is also currently working on updating our website. We've contracted Zing Studios based in Boulder, Colorado to do this. We're updating all of our content as well as the layout. We'll have more information on our priority habitats as well as our conservation projects. And we're also creating a species habitat matrix database. We published a paper on our species habitat matrix back in 2016, and we're now going to have a queryable database that you could modify and download as a CSV file, which you can search and modify by subregion, species, life stage, as well as habitat. This year we funded 4 conservation projects through U.S. Fish and Wildlife National Fish Habitat Action Plan funding. These are in New York, New Jersey, Maryland, and North Carolina. This is our first time funding conservation projects in New York and New Jersey, and it's also our first year funding 4 projects. The first project is a seagrass conservation moorings project in Cockles Harbor on Shelters Island in New York. Cockles Harbor has the most substantial eelgrass extent in any New York harbor, and we'll be working to retrofit traditional chain and block moorings with bungee-like conservation moorings to reduce the impact on the seagrass below. This will improve eelgrass habitat extent and quality and will benefit species such as bay scallop, fluke, puffers, alewives, American eel, and striped bass. And this is being led by the New York State DEC, the Division of Marine Resources. In New Jersey, we helped fund a portion of the Columbia Dam removal project. This will open up 11 miles of river and 9 miles of tributaries for shad and river herring, American eel, and sea lamprey. This is part of a larger project to restore Paulin's Kill, which is New Jersey's 3rd largest tributary to the Delaware River. The dam is the first obstruction to fish migration for Paulin's Kill, and this project will also improve public safety to reduce flooding and is being led by the Nature Conservancy. The project we're funding in Maryland will help restore SAV in freshwater and mesohaline regions. The Maryland DNR will be collecting seeds and distributing 3 different species of mesohaline and 1 freshwater species of SAV. The SAV will filter polluted runoff, provide food for waterfowl, provide habitat for blue crabs, juvenile striped bass, and other species, and will help the Chesapeake Bay program reach their goal of 185,000 acres of SAV. And finally, in North Carolina, we're helping to fund an oyster reef restoration project in Back Sound in the Rachel Carson Reserve. This will restore 0.11 acres of oyster reefs along Kerr Island in Beaufort. They'll be using oyster catcher materials to protect over 3 acres of salt marsh. In this area, the shoreline is eroding at a rate of 1 to 2 meters per year. So they're hoping this will help reduce that erosion rate and will benefit species such as red and black drum, spotted sea trout, blue crab, black sea bass, flounder, and gag grouper. And this project is being led by East Carolina University. I would also like to let y'all know that we this week released our FY 2019 funding. You can find it under opportunities and then funding on our website, and the deadline to apply for projects is September 25th. And if you need help accessing that announcement, just come find me at that table over there and I'll point you to it so that if you have any projects in mind, we're happy to take a look at them. I'd like to thank you all for your continued operational support, and with that, I'll take any questions.
Thanks, Lisa. Questions? Okay. Oh, Mel.
If I wanted to learn a little bit about that oyster catcher material, should I just talk to you afterwards?
Yeah.
I was just curious as to what it was.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, we had the inventor of it come to our steering committee meeting back in May, and so I have a whole PowerPoint presentation on it. Happy to share that with you.
Okay. Thanks, Lisa. Great report, and keep up the great work. As is at item 8 was a JMAC item, so we're going to skip that to the annual meeting. So we're up to item number 9, which is progress update on stock assessments, and we're going to do, Jeff Kipp is going to do shad first, and then Kristen's going to do horseshoe crab. So, Jeff?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm here to give an update on the progress of the 2019 American Shad benchmark stock assessment. Since I think I've given a previous progress report, we've had our data deadline come and go on June 1st. We have experienced many delays in the data submissions. At this point, we have the majority of data sets submitted. We are still waiting on a few data sets from some of the agencies. That has led to a little bit of delay in our milestones for the assessment. Our next milestone is our methods workshop. That was originally scheduled for October, and we're now going to bump that back a little bit into November. So we're currently planning that methods workshop, the timing and location of that workshop in November. So that'll be our next in-person meeting for the SHAD assessment, and again, that will be tentatively scheduled to present that to this board, or to the Shad and River Herring Management Board at the annual meeting in 2019. So I can take any questions on the Shad assessment now if there are any.
Justin?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just curious, Jeff, the methods workshop, what exactly is that and what sort of topics will that be covering?
So actually, that's the first time. This is really the first time we're doing a titled methods workshop, and so it's a little bit new take to the assessment process for some species that either have never been assessed or haven't been assessed in a long time. And so the idea and objective of that workshop is to sit down, take a look at what we have now from the available data, the types of inputs we were able to develop from those available data, and start generating some ideas and some discussions on what we think the appropriate assessment techniques are for that assessment. So given for shad, we're assessing several stocks along the coast with varying degrees of data availability and data types. We think that will be a really useful workshop to give some clarity as to how we're going to proceed for assessing those different stocks.
Other questions for Doug?
For the data that you're still waiting on, are the directors of the states that you're waiting on data aware that there is that they're still waiting on this data?
At this point, I don't think we've reached out to the directors. We've been working with states TC members to get those resolved. And again, at this point, we have the majority of the data sets, but there are still some. And I think we've at least been in contact with the TC members and have an idea of what the bottlenecks are there and what the issues are. But just wanted to make that clear that the data did come in quite late for a lot of the data sets. And for those we're still waiting on, it's unclear for some when they'll be available, but we are working with the TC members at this point to try and get those all available to the Stock Assessment Subcommittee.
John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Jeff, I know some of the stocks, such as the Delaware, are assessed independently. So is this assessment to look at all of these together, or is it just putting all these individual assessments together?
It is to look at the coast-wide resource, but we do have a stock structure group within the assessment, and right now we are moving forward with a stock structure of mostly by river systems. So it will be looking at individual rivers and treating those as independent stocks.
Other questions for Jeff? Okay, seeing none, Kristen's going to do horseshoe crabs now. Kristen?
Thank you. I'll actually echo what Jeff said, which is we've also experienced quite a lot of data issues with horseshoe crab as well as modeling issues. So we are also facing a delayed timeline. I'll start with the data issues. We did our landings validation back in November, and coming out of that, we noticed very large discrepancies between our ACCSP validated landings and the compliance reports. We do expect some wiggle room around terminal years. It wasn't 1,000 crabs here or there. It was sometimes on the order of 30,000 crabs from one state by year, so that our landings were several 100,000 crabs different when we compared compliance reports to our validated landings. We reached back out to some individuals. It was clear that this was more than one state, so Heather Connell at ACCSP actually had to do a second landings validation for horseshoe crab. And That happened in April and May of this year. So we were scheduled to give you the stock assessment by February next year, and we actually did not have final landings until last month. So we had some pretty big data problems for our landings. After that, we had similar problems with our biomedical landings, which we also need to assess this stock as it's one of our TORs. Those are still unresolved as of today. And we also had some issues with fishery independent data, sort of what Jeff was saying, some delays, some submissions that had problems that had to be revised. So all of that has sort of delayed our modeling as we handle these data management and QA/QC issues. We had our second modeling workshop last week, actually, and there we also identified some modeling problems. It was clear that the CSA for the Delaware Bay was not fully developed. At that meeting, where we anticipated viewing final runs and coming up with stock status, we were not able to do that. We did spend some extra time developing that model and need some more time to move that from its current platform into another modeling language. The positive news coming out of this is I think the CSA is going to be much more developed than it was last time. We're adding biomedical into the CSA, which was not there last time for the Delaware Bay. We've made bycatch estimates, and we should have a simulation model that we're testing it with to address some of the peer review comments from last time. So the good news is I think this is going to be a really good model. The bad news is it's not fully developed, and we're going to need more time. We're proposing moving it from presenting it to you all in February of next year to the following meeting. So we'll have our peer review around February and hopefully bring it to you in May. Just an update then from that final product. We will have, similar to last time series for the regions outside of Delaware Bay. Unfortunately, we don't have the level of data we need to run a model in those regions to get stock status and reference points at kind of a more quantitative level. We will do the time series, ARIMA, and we're exploring some others that will relate indices to catch. In the Delaware Bay, like I said, we should have a much better CSA model than we had last time and give us a really nice way to compare it to what's coming out of the ARM model. So positive news there. And with that, I can take some questions.
Richie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This actually would be a question for Jim. It seems like there's fairly substantial timely reporting and data availability, and I'm wondering if it's something that staff or the executive committee, is it worth reviewing these to see if there needs to be any changes? So I guess that would be my question. Is it something that should be looked into?
Okay, Tony's got an opinion.
Well, I don't know about an opinion. I think, Richie, it's a two-part issue. One has to do with the validation portion. You know, there's, and the coordinating council talked about this, and we're trying to work through this problem. And I think that ACCSP staff and assessment staff and coordinators are doing an excellent job trying to work through this issue, but there is a disconnect at times between the state ACCSP coordinator and the TC member and the information that they are providing to the commission. And that I think that there needs to be potentially a little bit more work on the state side on that coordination. And ACCSP is doing a great job trying to get that to happen, and we have changed some of our processes in order to try to better coordinate that. But I think back home, if folks could help us with that, that would be good. On the second part, there are delays that are happening. At times we are, bringing that to state directors when science staff says to me, hey, this person has gone way beyond their deadline. Then I go and I'll talk to perhaps Jim or Doug, whoever it is, and let them know that that is occurring. And I don't know if there's some additional steps that we need to do on that level. And that would be, I'd say, something that we could talk about.
Well, maybe we can do it, maybe we'll put this on the XCOM meeting for the next, and just have an update on it to see, better frame it out a little bit. We'll discuss it at that point. That's it. Yeah, Doug, Bob.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, this data issue is it's confounding. It's difficult. It's there's a lot of different sources for it. But our science staff, the modeler folks are spending a lot of time chasing down data. We got a lot of talented people, but a lot of their time goes to chasing data versus modeling, and that's probably not the most productive use of their time. Lynn Fagley, I think, is in the back of the room. Lynn Fagley is the chair of ACCSP Coordinating Council right now, and she is pushing an initiative to, I think she's calling it data accountability or something along those lines, to help make sure that what the data that is being provided by the states is up to the ACCSP standards, and then it may reconcile some of this differences between annual compliance reports and the ACCSP output from the database and those sorts of things. So there are efforts going on to sort this out, but I think executive committee or some other conversation to work through this would be helpful for sure.
Horseshoe crabs and data, great. John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for that update, Kristen. Rich Wong showed me some of the work that's been done, that he's been doing with the Delaware Bay stock, and it really looks great. Does pushing this back mean he'll have more time? Because I know we've told him to move ahead with getting the help he needs to do the ADMB work on that. So he'll have more time to get that work done?
That's the goal, to give him more time to fully develop that model, as well as move it into a platform where he can get some estimates of some error around his point estimates of fishing mortality and population abundance, because especially if that number is slightly different from what's coming out of the ARM, I think it's going to be critical that we have error around that. We need that to bring that to peer review. It'll also give us time to do that simulation testing, which the peer review, that's one of the reasons the peer review did not approve either of the models or any of the models last time, was because they hadn't been tested. And we did test the surplus production model and in fact eliminated it as a possibility for modeling horseshoe crabs. So we need that extra time for that, as well as developing a reference point to compare the model output.
Babalu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Kristen, can you speak more to the delays associated with the biomedical data and whether that's also being resolved or whether that's really sort of snagged?
So some of the landings in the biomedical overlapped. ACCSP does not house the biomedical data, with the exception of some New England, because of that double use policy. ACCSP, we get the bait landings from them. So it's less of a kind of compliance report ACCSP. But we did have some issues with some states putting their biomedical in with their landings or partially doing that. So that was the first level of problems, is can you please separate these out? The second level was then when we tried to extend that time series, because biomedical does start in 2004 when we started collecting that data more robustly, that would limit any modeling in the Delaware Bay from 2004 on, which is actually quite short for a horseshoe crab lifespan. So we kind of reached out to the biomedical, can you help us reconstruct a few years of data based on your record keeping, because they've kept wonderful records, at which point we found inconsistencies then between what we had and what they had. So we had 3 data streams, ACCSP, biomedical, and state data, and we have not yet resolved that. Fortunately, that right now the unresolved state is not in the Delaware Bay, so we can continue to model on that in the meantime, but it's certainly been an issue for several data streams and several sources of that discrepancy.
Just a quick follow, and I mean, I very much appreciate the efforts you guys are going through, and it just strikes me as almost hypocritical that we spend so much time complaining about the need for more timely stock assessments, and then once we get into the weeds, we get bogged down with these data issues. And I think it's really incumbent upon all of us, up and down the chain, to come together and really upfront and early, work as hard as we can to support the science needs to get these assessments done. And this is almost like a sad commentary on a problem that I realize is multifaceted and has to do with a lot of different moving pieces. So it doesn't sound like there's one particular direction to point in, but I'm guessing I speak for many when I say, we really need to do our jobs as best as we can to support the science, because we keep saying we need better science in a more timely fashion, and then we hear these reports. Thank you.
Yes. Okay, any other questions for Kristen? Okay, seeing none. Kristen, Jeff, thanks for your reports. Item number 10 is under non-compliance findings. Since we did not have one, we don't have an action under that. So that moves us into our last item, other business. Is there other business to come before the ISFMP Policy Board? Seeing none, we are adjourned.